Welcome to Science on a Mission, brought to you by Activate. This podcast series intends to demystify the path to commercialization for deep tech innovation. Through in-depth discussions with scientists, entrepreneurs, investors, and policy experts, we illuminate the steps necessary to take groundbreaking technologies from concept to commercial success. In this live recorded podcast episode, host Cortney Newell, Activate Senior Director of Development, talks to Prime Coalition's Margaret Lee, the Schmidt Family Foundation's Patrick McGrath, and Lyda Hill Philanthropies' Olivia Strader about how philanthropic organizations are poised to play a transformative role in advancing climate tech solutions in the face of escalating climate challenges. We hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us today. This is Catalyzing Change, and it's a panel on how philanthropy can be kind of a driving force in climate tech innovation. So I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'll allow our panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves. My name is Cortney Newell. I'm the Senior Director of Development at an organization called Activate Global. We're a nonprofit, and we run an entrepreneurial fellowship for scientists. Some of our climate tech companies are the alumni now and are some of the biggest names out there. We're very, very proud of them. They've collectively raised almost $2 billion in follow-on funding, and every year we're bringing 40, 50 new scientists into the world and launching them out as small businesses. So we're very proud of that. And today we want to talk with one of the most important sources of our support and support in general for climate change, the philanthropy world, to understand what's the role, where are the opportunities, where are the blockages, how can philanthropy play a unique role in driving forward that innovation and also the commercialization of that innovation so that it actually gets out in the world and does something and doesn't stay stuck in a lab. So I'll take a beat and I'll allow our panelists now to go ahead and introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Olivia Strader. I'm a senior associate at LH Capital / Lyda Hill Philanthropies. So we serve as the family office for Lyda Hill, who is one of the first signers of the Giving Pledge and has pledged to give away a little more than the majority, but all of her wealth by the time of her passing. And so I get the fun job of both investing and giving away capital across nature and science. And so how that applies here is really investing across grants to investments in climate tech and making sure that they can scale from research all the way to commercialization. And what we really try to do is make sure that we're using the best and most creative capital tools to drive impact and change. And so in climate tech, there's a whole world out there that we're still exploring. And we've learned a lot from biotech and now are applying it to climate tech.
Hey everyone, my name is Margaret Lee. I work as the manager of partnership strategy for an organization called Prime Coalition. We are a nonprofit, but what we do is we are on a mission to unlock catalytic capital to transform climate finance. So we've worked with over 250 different philanthropists over the first 10 years of our funding to mobilize over $300 million in catalytic capital towards early stage climate solutions. And we're also excited about addressing a next capital gap between venture capital and project finance. So we think a lot about creativity in terms of not just the money out, how we're investing the money, but also the money in. What are the different sort of philanthropic tools that we can use to unlock catalytic capital?
Hi, I'm Pat McGrath. I'm the program director for climate tech with the Schmidt Family Foundation. This is the foundation founded by Eric and Wendy Schmidt. It's a pretty broad portfolio in the family foundation, from human rights to oceans to ag to energy. My lens on it is I'm coming from a technology development side. My career has been in energy R&D. I'm a chemical engineer by training, came from a background of batteries and fuel cells, but over my career I've become something of a generalist. I've done everything from nuclear fusion to biofuels. As Margaret already alluded, one of the most important pieces that we're looking to tackle is the scaling gap of when we get a technology past the is this even possible stage, getting it to the scaled and into the real world stage is a real bottleneck or barrier or whatever metaphor we choose that we're looking to help tackle.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. And thank you so much for being here. So the first question, and it's kind of a broad one, but I would love to just kind of have y'all take it where you will, is how can philanthropic organizations or philanthropists leverage their unique role to catalyze climate tech, and where is the opportunity gap that philanthropies can really help fill?
Yeah. So I would view a philanthropist as someone who's not only deploying capital, but has convening power as well. And so philanthropy can come into a room and bring together not only NGOs, but government officials, venture capitalists, all sorts of different table building. And so that's really the role that we can play outside of just capital. with that being said, capital is really important because we can be really creative. We're not necessarily, there's returns driven on the investment side, but on the philanthropic side, it's making sure it drives the most impact and scale. And so how you do that might look different, whether that's a grant, whether that's a loan, whether that's investment capital. And so philanthropy has the opportunity to kind of be the most creative person in the room, but also be a table builder and make sure that all different stakeholders are there to make sure that the solutions not only are built, de-risked, but also can scale.
I'd add that what I love about philanthropy is that it can really de-risk a lot of things that other types of capital can't. So something that we've built at Prime Coalition is a blended fund called Azola Ventures. And that is a $239 million fund that combines both catalytic and what we call full cycle capital. So we have about 1/3 of that is charitable capital in the eyes of the IRS. And then the other 2/3 of it is mission aligned and impact aligned capital. But it can take the form of mission related investments or program related investments. So not just thinking about what is the actual type of capital that you're using, but also what are the different funding mechanisms that you can use and being open to that. I think that's really the thing for me about philanthropy is recognizing the power that you have as a philanthropist and using that to unlock things that otherwise wouldn't come to scale.
I don't want to repeat, but I would just like to double click on the convening power and also just recognizing there is an ecosystem. I talk about the scaling gap as a big problem, but I don't think it's the role for philanthropy to write the check for a $200 million facility. I think it's to work with the ecosystem and the downstream funders who could make these things happen at scale. So I do think it's important to recognize, like, don't try to boil the ocean. It's not going to work, but identify what are the gaps, the bottlenecks that you can with. While there's a lot of philanthropic capital available, it's not enough to solve all of the problems. So look for the points of leverage.
I want to build off of something you said, Margaret. You've got a lot of capital. You guys are deploying. You have a really interested blended model. Essentially, the return philanthropy is looking for is impact. So how are we maximizing that? And there's so many different things that we need to do right now to address climate. How are we putting those in some sort of priority order?
Yeah, totally. I can speak to the different investment criteria that we have at Prime. And I will also say Prime is a nonprofit, and we have built and launched funds underneath the nonprofit that have spun out. So Azola Ventures is a standalone company currently that spun out in October of 2021. So when I'm speaking about the investment criteria, I'm talking about that as a collaboration between Prime and Azola specifically, and then also some of the work that we are looking towards in the bridging the gap between climate project finance and venture. So the way we prioritize things at Prime is around 3 different investment criteria: gigaton scale climate impact potential. That's very hard to measure, and just even scope. Additionality, which is this wouldn't be funded but for a philanthropic intervention. And the third one is commercialization, essentially. So there's a bridge to somewhere. So when we're thinking about the role that philanthropy can play, we're also thinking about not just what the role and the intervention that is happening, but also about where to go after that. So it's thinking about what happens at the point of intervention, point in time. This company wouldn't otherwise be funded but for us, but also what do we want to see happen after that?
I guess actually to follow on the additionality question. So one piece, just want to acknowledge, I think this is like a really, really, really hard question to answer. Like, it's philosophically impossible to prove. Like, we're talking about what would happen if you didn't do this. Like, we can't actually answer that question. So I do think what Prime has done exceptionally well is set up a system to really poke down and make sure it's like we're not just throwing money at something that was going to happen with or without us, and that's important. I think it's important to look at the ecosystem there, and it's like we can zoom in on this individual case and wrap ourselves around the axle about would this thing happen with or without us. But I think it's important to also just look at all of the players at different stages in the ecosystem to say, is there a problem here? Is there a bottleneck here? And I think that the additionality of having tackled the earliest stage piece is like unquestioned, without question, we've done something there. And I do think it's important to zoom out and just acknowledge that within the overall system that this philanthropic intervention made a difference. Even if on each individual case, it's hard to answer that question, at the system level, it absolutely did.
Yeah, let me add a little bit more on additionality because it's so hard. It's a point-in-time assessment. That's how we approach it at Prime. And some of the things that are really important about the Prime models that we build in third-party governance. So we convene a subset of folks who are downstream of Prime, who are more likely to invest in other climate tech companies. And so we ask them, would you fund this today? And they say no. And if they say no, then we go, great, we'll look at them a little bit further. That's essentially one of the many inputs, along with circumstances of the round. So, for instance, has this company been trying to raise, and have they been not successful in raising? And then also the question is why? And the answers to the why something might qualify for additionality are things like the founding team is unproven, or there's a lot of tech risk, or there's a big question about, or there might be a binary go or no go question. So those are the things that we dive deeper into, is not just like, would this be funded, but also what are the reasons why? And is that a risk that philanthropy and Catalytic Capital can play to take on?
I would love to hear more examples that you've seen of really either effective collaboration or places where maybe there's still some friction and we need to kind of grease those wheels.
There's a lot of federal funding coming through the doors, both through the DOE and also IRA, IIJA, a lot of different acronyms. But what that really does is it sends a lot of money to the state organization. So, for example, in Texas, where we're based, there was over $2 billion of water infrastructure funding coming to the State Water Development Board. But that also then is deployed. And so we need to make sure that there's capacity on the ground to make sure that those dollars are used to the best and highest use by the organizations who are in those communities and know how to deploy it best. So what that looked like for us is sitting back as a philanthropist, talking to those who are boots on the ground and seeing, okay, there's a capacity constraint. We're going to build technical assistance so that nonprofits can apply for these grants to actually unlock this large government funding that's coming through the door. But a lot of that is looking back and empowering those who do the job day in, day out, and know how to do it, but they just need to grow their resources a little more.
It sounds like maybe a little bit granular, but for most DOE funding, there's a cost share requirement. And it's a really, really tough thing to ask a company to go raise money to get money. I've seen a very effective use of philanthropy is that just being available to be cost share for early stage R&D awards, just to help get them going. And maybe on that basis, there's leverage that they could, if they're successful, raise more funding. But that cost share requirement, it puts companies in a tough spot. And if there's a way to collaborate and for philanthropic capital to help provide cost share towards a government award, that's a good point of leverage.
One of the things that we have talked about is how we're measuring and assessing. I do think that there is a role that philanthropy can play in creating, kind of taking that first step and creating some standards or some kind of baseline understanding of how we're thinking about impact in climate tech. And so I'd be really interested, one, in how you in-house, we've touched on this a little already, but if anything you want to add about how you in-house do this, either at Lyda Hill or at Schmidt, or if you have more to add about Prime, but then also kind of more on a meta level. Like, what can philanthropy do to drive forward the problem we're having right now of not, people out in space saying, well, I don't know how to think about this, so there's nothing I can do about it. Like, there's no standards and I'm overwhelmed. And so that creates a lot of paralysis, I think. So yeah, I would be really curious how you're thinking about it, and then also where you see opportunities to unlock this more broadly.
So we are values aligned impact measurement. So it's all in-house. And the reason for that is because every sector is very different as to what those baselines are. And what we've seen, though, is that there's still a lot of work for philanthropy to fund science to actually create those baselines. So we've seen this in a lot of carbon accounting. There's a lot of ambiguity still, and that's really slowing the market down. At the same time, for example, the wildfire that's happening in Texas, the smokehouse fire, it's a huge wildfire. There's a lot of carbon credits that are soil credits up in the panhandle. We do not know exactly how a wildfire is impacting those soil carbon credits. But science has the ability to do that, and that's where philanthropy can come in and start understanding what is the baseline threshold for measurement, and also how can we all start having at least a conversation around it and be sitting at a table wondering, here are the metrics that we're at least comparing, what are you comparing, and how do we start having some sort of standard, at least on a sector level, but it's going to vary by sector, location, et cetera.
So a separate initiative that I'm involved in, but this is outside of the technology program on the science of the carbon cycle. the error bars on those questions are so large that we really do need actually some fundamental scientific, both in measurement and modeling, to actually understand the impact, especially if we're going to talk about nature-based solutions. So that's one area, and I think that that's just a case of getting greater certainty on the impact of certain interventions on the carbon cycle. From the technology side of the question, I guess I've made my peace with I don't think I'm ever going to get a clear answer on an individual project. So I'm looking more in the aggregate as to, look, before we get to gigatons, we have to go through megatons, and we're not doing megaton projects. So that's really my standard for impact is that, as it is right now, you can count on one hand. What are we doing at the megaton level? If we can get that to a level where we're doing dozens of megaton projects, and hopefully some of those turn into tens of megatons, and hopefully some of those turn into 100 megatons, probably not individual projects, but for technologies deployed worldwide. Seeing that acceleration is the impact that we're looking for. That I'm guilty of this myself as an engineer, of trying to dig into the weeds of a particular technology, of is this itself a gigaton solution that's going to take over the world? And I am now very consciously thinking about, at the project level, has this technology reached a point where we've got a project that makes sense, that will pencil out, and that we will see what the next project and how that will scale, but we need to do more of these projects and get those shots on goal to even get that answer.
I just wanted to add two things here. One of them is that what I really appreciate about what Olivia and Pat just said right now is comfort with uncertainty. That's something that I think philanthropy can really bring into the space that others cannot, especially if you're someone in VC who has these extremely specific goals and incentives and metrics that you're measuring yourself against. And I think that's something that philanthropy can bring to bear that others can't. I also want to plug Crane, which is the in-house emissions reduction potential technology tool that we developed in-house at Prime when we were trying to figure out how we would measure what the the climate impact potential of a company might be, or a solution might be. It's open access thanks to philanthropy, and it's available at cranetool.org.
So another topic that I'd love to hear you guys comment on, especially coming from kind of such different, a lot of overlap, but such kind of different spaces, is kind of emerging tech, and then also just emerging trends in general in climate tech innovation that you're really excited about, or that you think is really important and doesn't get enough attention right now, or that you think maybe is like the next thing that people should be looking into?
So I'm deeply passionate about wildfires, both individually and on a professional level, because it's something that wildfires are solvable. We have mega fires, and that can change very quickly. We know how to do it, but we need better, faster technology that can be adopted by practitioners. But that also applies to all of climate adaptation. It's receiving 8% of financing, and yet, while we need to do things faster and get to the scale that we need, we're not on track. And so we also need to learn how to live in the state of the world that's happening. And whether that's a wildfire, whether that's a hurricane, whether that's a flood, people are already being impacted. And usually it's the people who emit the least are the ones who are impacted the most. And so how can we uplift those communities to ensure that they actually have the resources available with new technologies to ensure that they are having a livable future? And so for me, I think wildfires are really interesting because it brings together all different types of industries, whether that's insurance, whether that's utilities, venture. You have all different types of funders and stakeholders in the room that can adopt on a mass scale change for technical solutions that are not wildly capital intensive.
I would love to bring in, as we talk about early climate infrastructure, also thinking about the people who are impacted by an actual solution once you get steel in the ground. It's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. I have a background in things like how to build a more responsible mineral supply chain at the intersection of human rights and extractives. And those lessons you can still pull forward from the extractive industry into what we're doing in the climate tech space. It isn't just, we need this tech. It's, we need this tech because of the people who are in the world. And that's the thing that I think that we can tend to miss sometimes in trends. And I think that's actually something that philanthropy can really play a role in, is also using your voice and using that power to say, let's also think about not just what this company could do in terms of climate, but also what that could mean for the people who live in a space. And how do we be a good neighbor to those people? And how do we think about what this company might actually expand into and go beyond sort of benefits and co-benefits to actually being something that's powerful and a force for good.
I really get excited about ideas that can leverage existing supply chains. So whether that's leveraging ag waste is something, but leveraging cleanup of mining waste or other opportunities you can do with tailings, but also retrofitting existing infrastructure. It's not always a very it's not the sexiest story to go sell investors, but if you can retrofit a coal plant to be something better, that's part of the solution. I mean, one, I think that's helpful for that community. So it's a good part of the transition, but it also operates at scale quickly. And that's solutions like that are the ones that at the earlier stage may be a tough sell for some of these technologies to go raise the early stage if you don't have a greenfield technology that can take over the world. But I think there's a potential for a lot of impact with retrofit or leveraging existing infrastructure to make that part of the solution sooner. Those are ideas that I'm interested in.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in this way, too, we talk a lot at Activate about how climate isn't really, I mean, it is a sector, but it's also not really a sector. It's essentially, it's everything. It's totally cross-cutting. It's across all of these different industries in really big ways, which would be direct climate technologies like carbon capture, and then also in really like specific ways, like a different way to build something or a retrofit of something that is actually like, is that climate? We would say yes. Like all of that needs to be happening. We need all of that moving forward in concert. We need a completely different economy and a different way of doing things. And we need like, it's going to take a lot of scientists and a lot of companies working on all kinds of different problems to do that. But I would love to hear y'all talk about how philanthropy can think about the long term, kind of the sustainability and the long term impact of the investments. So yes, we need to get a lot of stuff out the door really soon. But also, how do you weigh that against kind of the long-term impact that philanthropy is trying to have that's going to outlive their founders, outlive all of the people who are working on it today, hopefully take the next generations forward when we all survive and don't have a climate apocalypse. So yeah, I would be really curious to think how you guys in your own jobs think about this or in your own organizations think about this.
I think about climate apocalypse a lot, just to be clear. Yeah, I think about, and this is also Prime is a nonprofit, so we run on general operating grants. That is how Prime works. And one of the things that I think about a lot in terms of that is like, what do we do if general operating grants run out? I don't think that's going to happen, but I think about that. I think about what do we do if people step back and step away from things where their values are aligned. These are the things that keep me up at night, really. And I don't know that I have the best answer, but what I love about talking to people who really care and have something to give, whether that's capital or another type of resource, is thinking expansively about the sort of optimism that you can have in the space, even though it's hard and climate doomism is extremely real, but also thinking about what gives me hope is the people that I work with and the people who really care about this work. So I think that's actually where I go is like, how do we turn this from just sort of the different capital stacks, but also into community, into partnership, into people, and thinking about that as the core of everything that we're doing, as opposed to sort of these other incentives and metrics, which are really hard to measure, but also like we can do it if we do it together. I am a climate optimist sometimes.
So our organization also funds in biotech, and there's a lot of crossover in the sense of in biotech and in climate tech, you have valleys of death. And so what we've seen is that philanthropy can really serve as the bridges to opportunity. And how do you make sure that we're actually able to scale and leverage both government funding to philanthropic funding to industry funding and bringing together all in a conversation to make sure that we're using capital as efficiently as possible. And that has not been optimized in biotech, but what it shows to me is that we're willing to take the risk if we're having the conversation. And so making sure that you have the conversation in climate tech is pivotal, but also making sure that you're bringing all of these stakeholders in the room. And the difference being that in biotech, it's really clear there's an illness. And you get a lot of buy-in in biotech because someone personally was affected by said illness. You have an investor across the table who has someone in their wheelhouse that has been affected. They are bought in on why it's a risk. That is not necessarily the case with climate. And so it's also making sure to your point, Courtney, that climate is not just viewed as a sector, it's viewed as a risk lens across all of these different sectors that we need to account for, and that there is also a balance sheet and there is a total for that risk that we need to be making sure that we're accounting and able to see pretty clearly.
Pulling back the lens even more broadly, would love to hear kind of in any way, like lessons learned or success stories from the work that you've done in the climate space and advancing climate technology and innovation. What have you seen that worked super, super well? Where have you seen either your own organization or one that you admire have a really high impact and have tried something new, something that really made a big difference, and that you think is something that the rest of us can all learn from?
The big thing that's coming to mind for me is that willingness to fail and willingness to try. It's so hard to be an entrepreneur. In Western society, we're not socialized to fail. We're socialized to perform and to produce. And so that's the thing that I'm always really impressed by, is when there's a company that says, we see a problem here, I'm going to give it a shot and I'm going to build something cool. And then also I'm going to do everything I can in my power to bring it to fruition. I will think for a moment about particular companies, but I do want to give a hat tip to a lot of the amazing Prime Impact Fund and Azola Ventures companies that exist. The tagline we like to use is from fungus to fusion. So there's just everything out there, just thinking through what are the different sort of capital gaps that exist, and also what are the sort of different market gaps, and what was it like, 10 years ago when I didn't work at Prime, and how hard it was to actually start things back then. So that willingness to fail is really what comes to mind for me about how to bring things to life.
Absolutely. No, I one of my favorite things to talk about Activate companies is from the very first cohort we ever had in 2015, fellows were working on things like carbon transformation. And truly back then, that doesn't seem that long ago, but people were like, that's not real. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And now one of our alumni companies, 12, is one of the biggest companies working in this. And now it feels obvious. Oh, sure. Yeah. Like 12. Cool. Of course, we're going to make stuff out of carbon, but it was not like that when we started with that company. People told them that was not real. And there's a woman here today, Caitlin Suarez. She's the CEO and co-founder of Terawatts. And I was just talking to someone with her last night about, she's a new company. She's been in our program for 1 year. She's helping, she would explain it so much better, but basically wireless transmission of power underground. And before she came to us, and still sometimes, but definitely before she came to us, people would say, that's not real. Like, that's sci-fi. That doesn't exist. And Activate and other philanthropic organizations and other people who want to work in this early space said, well, we are going to look at the fundamentals. We see that there's something here. We believe in you. And we think that you should try it. Take this risk. It's an enormous amount of personal risk. But a lot of people will tell these scientists, oh, that you can't do that. Now it's easy in hindsight to say, of course they could do it, but at the time it's really not. And so I really love that, Margaret. I do feel like that willingness to say, we're going to stand with the people who will take enormous risks, and we will support them to see that through and see what can come of it. And we're willing to go with them on that journey. I think that that's a huge role. So I really appreciate you calling that out, because we've got a lot of people like that in our portfolio too that I'm always super excited to share about. But yeah, I would, Olivia, Pat, other kind of lessons learned, success stories?
Maybe one lesson is just I've said it a few times. I'm an engineer. I have my strong opinions about what's the best choices are going to be. And I've been wrong more often than I've been right. So I think some humility when looking at technologies and thinking about, well, what can this be 5, 10, 20 years down the road? That's another one of these unknowable questions. There are so many variables that are impossible to predict. So much of it is going to be dependent on policy regimes. And so I guess to me, a lesson there is not to sharpen the pencil so much at the very beginning. If something is a good idea, to give it a shot and give enough resources to get an answer, and be willing to take the risk that it's not going to work on the 10-year time horizon, but not to kill something by, modeling an analysis for unknowable questions before you even have a chance to answer those questions. So I think it's just a different flavor of the risk is maybe suspending disbelief on the earliest stage ideas for some things that I would have told you couldn't have worked. Same story you just told there for 12. Some things that do work that the conventional wisdom was wrong.
I also want to add just 2 other things around patience. That's one of the things that philanthropy can provide, patience and risk tolerance. And then one of the other things that I love about working in climate is just that it's such a big tent, and it is all hands on deck. And so there's a lot of collaboration that happens formally and informally, partnering on things like diligence, people who volunteer with Prime saying, yeah, I want to like dig deeper into this weird specific thing that you're looking at.
We are finally getting to the increasing sense of urgency that we have got to do this, and we've got to do it faster, bigger, and better than we've ever done it before. And so it is all hands on deck, and I love that collaboration. And unfortunately, we're winding down. We've only got a few minutes left. So speaking of collaboration, I want to have a chance for everyone to share like a final thought, if that's something that you'd like to do.
Yeah, so I'll share kind of the guiding principle that guides our office as we think through this really massive problem is do what others can't do and won't do, not what they can and will do. And that was a quote by Warren Buffett that he said to Lyda when she signed the Giving Pledge. And it's something that really guides us as we tackle these really big problems. And while they can be overwhelming and seem almost impossible, it's the impossible problems that keep us up every day and are the things that get us out of bed. And so doing that with other people makes it possible. And that collaboration is pivotal in how we move forward.
I love that, because what I was going to say is that everyone has power. Even if you aren't a philanthropist and don't have capital to give or resources to give, everyone has power. Everyone has a role to play in this. And I think it's the folks that work on climate who say every job is a climate job. So I just want to say that there are things that folks can do inside of the spheres of influence that they're in towards climate, even if it isn't specific to climate tech and philanthropy.
I guess my last thought will be this next stage of what we're facing, through 2030, we really need to be focused on doing things at scale, which is a lot of different problems than what we've been tackling for the last 5 years. So I think that a lot of the work that you all have done, the early stage of the pipeline is healthier than it was 5 years ago because of some of the experiments that we tried. We need new experiments to see how do we get these things to scale, because venture will take us so far, but it's not going to take us all the way to 100. And we need new tools and new experiments to get us there.
Absolutely. I mean, those are all such excellent closing thoughts. The only thing I want to add, and I think it is like crosses all of that, is there is hope. There is an enormous amount of hope. There are really dedicated people working on this every day, and they're brilliant, and they have the passion, the resources, and the ability to solve these problems.